Hello, everyone. Welcome. Am I audible? Yes. Excellent. Thank you for showing up to listen to us. Over the next 40 or 50 odd minutes, we are going to, like Shaurya said, talk about what makes us who we are and how migration complicates our stories. Identity is a complex and difficult subject, but perhaps even more so in the context of the Indian subcontinent. We don't really have a common religion, common festivals, common culture, common language even, that could unite us, that could bring us together. I mean, just as an example, my father is from Uttar Pradesh, from Ayodhya. My mother is a Khatri Punjabi, but I was born and brought up in Calcutta, so I speak Bengali better than I speak Avdi and Punjabi. But the Bengali I speak is very different from the Bengali that is spoken across the border in Bangladesh, and some of my friends who are from there can barely make out what I'm saying when I'm speaking to them in Bengali. And then, of course, there's class, there's caste, there's subcaste. And all of this is further complicated by a history of bloody partitions and migrations. Both Shom and Sheela have dealt very well with some of the themes related to identity and migration in their books, one fiction, one book of non-fiction. And we are going to try and unpack what these books tell us about these very complicated narratives. So welcome both of you, and perhaps you could both start, Sheela, starting with you, read just a short passage for people who haven't read the books, just to give them a taste of what the book is like, and then Shom, perhaps you can as well.
Yeah, so the book is about a detailed look at my name, Sheela Banerjee, and 5 of my closest friends. So this is a little excerpt about my name. Once prized open, our names reveal a multitude of stories, reveal feelings, states of consciousness, and lost histories that embody who we really are and where we come from. Names are words that contain emotional charge, are filled with associations. If we contemplate them for just an instant, we are thrown down the rabbit hole of memory. I think of my own name, and I'm suddenly 7 years old. I'm at Wood End Park Junior School in Hayes, on the edge of West London, not far from Heathrow Airport. I'm sitting at my wooden desk, which is covered with scratches and old pen markings, has a lid that flips open, and an old-fashioned well for the ink. This is 1975. Sean Cook rocks back and forth on his chair next to me. I'll play with Wendy and Tracy Howard on the climbing frame at playtime. My name is Sheela Banerjee. It immediately points to difference, to dissonance. It tells the world that I'm the child of immigrants. No one can pronounce my surname. It marks me out as Indian. And the presence of this strange name in this English working class school points to the story of post-war mass migration to this country and to the global empire that brought my parents over here.
Wonderful, wonderful. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Sheela's book I finished in over 2 nights, and I told my wife of 15 years that please read this book to understand me. It's that wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm talking about a childhood very far from Sheela's town, a place called Guwahati, which is the capital city of northeastern India. You might have heard of Assam tea. So this is the capital city in sometime in the early 80s. If you go to Guwahati, this small town in the 80s is no more there. So this is a recollection of a time as I was growing up. And we are talking about the issues of migration. So just imagine from there to me in 2025 in London, Guwahati to London. That's one of the themes here. It's the chapter 4 of the book called The New Boy. Guwahati had never intended to be a city. The very name discouraged ambition. Gua, betel nut, and Hati, market. That was the vision. For a long time, it managed this mediocrity adequately. its residents were satisfied with the town's average amenities, a few cinema halls for entertainment, schools and colleges, some of them good, a second-rate sports stadium, a hospital that treated the rich as disdainfully as it did the poor, 3 main markets used as much for gossip as commerce, and most importantly, time, a lot of it to chew the stubborn betel nut. When change arrived, it visited every doorstep in Guwahati. Overnight, families became rich. On the roads, motorbikes appeared, and later cars. Inside homes, televisions, and even air conditioners arrived. Buildings grew taller, and men, having acquired guns, appeared bigger. Some lost a limb to a crude, homemade bomb. Others were taken in the middle of the night. Many said Guwahati's ancient protector, the goddess Kamakhya, had abandoned her temple, angry at the barricades and checkpoints erected between her and her people. The mighty Brahmaputra flowed as before. Only the boatmen knew that the waters were a shade darker. The 2 boys, however, paid no heed. The bombs always went off elsewhere, and who could be bothered to kidnap them? Youngsters did vanish, but rarely from their school, and curfews meant street cricket. But change spared no one, and for these 2, that is Samar Datta and his best friend Rizu Kalita, it arrived with the new boy. Thank you.
Honestly, both of you have written such wonderful books, and you both read so well that I have half a mind to say, screw this, just keep reading one after the other. But we want people to buy the book and read it for themselves, so I will ask you a couple of questions. Sheela, like you said, your book talks about what it means to be a migrant, explores what it means to be a migrant, and you start with the most it's such a genius idea, really, to start with that most basic and fundamental of identity markers, our names. But the thing is, we don't really give our names a second thought. I mean, that's the last thing that is such a given, that we don't really think twice about what they mean to us, what they mean to the world. So what made you pick that as a starting point? And tell us the story of your name, how it came to be, and how your own relationship with your name has evolved.
I mean, I think you're totally right. You just don't give a second thought to your name. It's like something that you might say on the phone, or you introduce yourself, but you really don't think about it. But I think I was studying English at the time. I'd just done a PhD in English literature, and I did a lot of close reading. And that practice of analysing words, pulling apart the threads and seeing the history of language, that's contained in individual words, I think that led to it. And also, I remember doing a seminar with one of my classes when I was teaching, and asking the students to tell me something about their names, just as a kind of icebreaker. And all the stories that suddenly started pouring out were so amazing. And when I started thinking about my own name, I suddenly realised there was so much more to it than at first appears. It's almost a blank when you first think about it. But when I started thinking about Sheela, it's actually quite a boring name. It was a very common name in the 70s of older women, older English women. Like, I think one of my dinner ladies was called Sheela. It was a name of a famous sitcom actress called Sheila Hancock. And loads of Indians gave their names like Sheila, Anita, these hybrid names. But why is it that I've got this hybrid name? And that immediately points to the fact that my parents were immigrants trying to fit in, having difficulties with their own names, which was the sign of much greater difficulties about fitting in. And they were trying to make life easier for me. And ultimately, as I was saying in the book, names are about power. Because you didn't find the reverse happening in India during imperialism. You didn't find our white colonizers calling themselves Ruby or Leela. They stuck to Gwendolyn and Edith and Victoria, And so I think that was the starting point, really.
That is such that is such a brilliant, and the way you write about what your name has meant to you in different stages of your life is also quite brilliant. And is that something that you could quickly touch upon before I move on to Shom?
Yeah, I think basically when I was a child, as I was saying, it was a name that didn't belong to my generation, because my parents had chosen a name that was in the society, but it was older women that had this name. Nobody of my generation had the name, and so it was like a kind of dress that didn't fit that I was walking around in, which was a kind of sign of the fact that I didn't fit, and I really didn't like my name. And also Banerjee immediately marked me out as foreign. You know, it turned into Baintree and Banerjee and Barjee, and it's hard if you're living, if you know, I was a brown child with this foreign name, with brown skin, living in a very working class English town, Hayes, which was next to Southall, which was home to Punjabis, and there was a lot of racial tension when I was growing up, so it wasn't a name that I was very comfortable with. But as you're saying, it changes. A name is like a kind of barometer of the kind of energies, the social energies that are around you. And as soon as we went back to India, which we did a couple of times for good, you know, the status of my name completely changed. Suddenly Sheela it's also an Indian name, it's a Bengali name, and it was pronounced completely differently. It went from Sheela to Sheela, which sounded so much nicer. And Banerjee, it went from a very reviled name, you know, Asians were really not popular in the 70s, to it's a high caste Brahmin name. Now, caste is something I have to say at the start that I totally abhor. I loathe the caste system. And so it kind of gave us, I think, a superiority through the name, undeserved, but nevertheless completely palpable. You know, every time my parents stopped in the street in Chandanagar, where my family were from, and had a conversation, I felt like there was a 3,000-year-old history epic that was in my name without even being spoken. And so it was a very changeable kind of entity as I grew up.
I hope to come back to this later in the conversation, but Shom, you explore the themes of identity and migration through this sort of epic novel, if you will. But at the same time, having known you a little, I also know that there are deeply personal resonances in this book to your own life, both directly as well as perhaps indirectly in terms of themes that have shaped your own life. What was the starting point for you for Red River?
Well, the starting point was, very academic, and I had lofty ideas of writing a book which would sell 150 copies for £100 each.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. Actually, this is quite fascinating to me, because I don't think this was said in your introduction, but you are an academic as well.
Yes.
And why did you pick the form of a novel, an epic novel at that, also to tell the story?
Okay, so this could go on for a few hours, but to keep it brief, my idea was to look at a small Indian town or a village between two election cycles and see how it changes. That was the idea. So I went back to Assam. I was born in Assam. I wasn't born there, but I grew up in Assam and left it when I was 16. So after 20 years, I returned. I didn't go back to Guwahati. I went to Upper Assam, a smaller town, and we were newly married. Georgie was pregnant, and we lived in a kind of tea gardenish area. We built a bamboo hut, and I started interviewing people. This was supposed to be an ethnography, 107 families, hierarchies, caste. And then the stories of these families started coming out, right? People who feel that they're people of the soil, migrant tea laborers. And then in between, my father started deteriorating, and before he passed, I went back to Calcutta. And, he had come in 1942 as riots were breaking out in Dhaka as a 6-year-old, right? And with a brother who was 2 years old and a pregnant mother. They walked from Dhaka to Kolkata. And he has never spoken to me about the traumas of growing up, leaving home. And I thought, I'm not going to hear this again. I wanted to know. So there are few things, and I'll tell you the deeply personal moments which shape your adult life. And as I was asking him, I told him, Baba, how did you react? You're 6 years old, you're leaving home, walking. And he said, you know, till I was 14, and I could understand my mother's pain, I asked her every day, Ma, Dhaka kobe jaun? Which is, when do I go back to Dhaka? Now that broke me. That moment, and you know, I was going to become a father. How do you deal with, and I have lived with this trauma of this father's one line, no, Dhaka kobe jaun? Go back. And he never went back. Finally, when he got a passport, he traveled till Agartala border, but didn't dare cross. Because if he crossed, his exile would have become real. He kept speaking Bengal all throughout his life in Guwahati. That is one big moment where I realized the pain of migration. And I was talking to migrants, and I was born to migrant parents in Assam, where Bengali was reviled. You were the Bongals. And Bongal Khada was a movement. Yeah. So all of this collided in such ways that I couldn't keep it in an ethnography anymore. The stories became bigger. And then I went into a 13-year deep dive and wrote this book. So there it is. Yeah, I didn't intend it. And this was 2 times the size of what this book is. So half my stories have vanished, as you well know.
Some of his privileged friends have read this book when it was about 3 times the size, and I happen to be one of them.
Yes. So yeah, that is the story.
No, but what's interesting, and what just came out when you were talking about also, nowadays when we talk about migration, there is a hegemonic narrative that is thrust upon the idea of migration. We talk about a certain kind of migration to the West. But what your book does so wonderfully is talk about how many different kinds of migrations there are. Bulk of migrations in the world are still internal migrations. Yeah. There are migrations undertaken for economic reasons. There are migrations that are, forced by conflict, like your father's. What did these? You yourself are sort of born to migrants, but a migrant to this country.
Yes.
How do these migrations contrast with one another when you were trying to unpack what they meant for the lives of people who undertake them?
When you're writing a story, especially fiction, you don't start off with writing themes. You write a story. And I was just writing a story about my entire idea was to, if at all there is a theoretical position, was to think about the nation state. So I just wanted to talk about the army, the separatists, the movement of separatism, and the refugee who wants to belong. The army man believes in the nation state and its borders. The refugee desperately wants to belong, and the separatist wants to tear away. So I had a story of 3 friends, and I suddenly found this, it's not even well thought out. So it just happened to come in together. And because of the stories I was hearing and my own personal background, it just kind of, later on, as I almost read the manuscript in full, people started telling me about these themes. You started talking to me. I wrote a story about 3 friends in a troubled land where no one really belonged and no one knew how to belong. And the state itself did not want to belong to India, right? There's a movement, the Alpha movement still carries on. So all these themes emerged later, but I think the point is that human life is all about migration. When you start writing a big story, there is movement, right? So therefore it just, I think, emerged more from the story than me wanting to talk about migration.
No, that makes sense. Continuing on the same thread, Sheela, your parents were first generation migrants to the UK. You're a second generation migrant. And I wonder, while writing the book, did you have a chance to consider, and of course I'm sure even in other ways you've had the opportunity to think about this, about how your experiences differ from theirs and what belonging might have meant to them and what it means to you. This is obviously complicated by the fact that the UK itself has changed so considerably from the 70s to now. But what were some of the things that came up when you were writing this book about the differentiation between first-generation migrants and second-generation migrants?
It's so interesting what you're saying, Sean, about that yearning, that constant yearning to return. And I think that's something that I grew up with as almost like a palpable reality. And so it seemed like when I was growing up, first of all, like we lived at home in a completely Bengali cocoon. You know, no English people, no Westerners ever seemed to pass our threshold. You know, it was just me, my aunts and uncles, my cousins, one of whom's here today. And it was Friday, Saturday nights, every holiday to my aunt and uncle in Lowestoft with all my cousins there. So it was a completely Bengali cocoon, and within that cocoon was a kind of shared language, obviously Bengali, but also constant talk of India, Indian politics, planning to go back, talk about the parents, talk about the relatives. And actually we did go back the entire time, because my father, although wasn't brought over here through trauma, he dreamt of coming to England. It was his absolute sort of, you know, it was like paradise in his mind. But there was still that dream of return, because it was his job as the eldest son to return and look after his elderly parents, especially as his sisters were over here. And so we constantly had that sense of not belonging in the home as well, because it was this, we were in this liminal world that seemed half like I was in India, but in my front room in Hayes, and half here. But also, I think in terms of the differences, of course, as a second generation person, even though I grew up partly in West Bengal, but that was only a few years, really my consciousness was shaped as a Bengali kid over here. And so half of me was speaking Bengali, eating Bengali food, had diye khachilam, eating with my hands, and hearing all this in the grown-ups chitter-chatter. But also, I was obsessed by British culture. I was a goth when I was 14, you know, getting the crimpers out, crimping my hair, and watching Top of the Pops, obsessed by Susie and the Banshees, and wanting to be as British as possible. And so the belonging was very confused. But sometimes when I would go on holiday, when I was 16, 20, whatever, back to India, I remember getting to Dom Dom Airport, which was just this kind of, almost like a kind of, seemed like a hut to me then. It was so different to what it is now. And just the smell of the kind of, there's something about the smell of India, and I would just want to cry, because that was like home to me as well. And so I was completely torn between the two cultures, very much so. And also I grew up with Bengali music, and you know, my father in the car would have he had all the records of Hemanta Mukherjee, who's this iconic Bengali singer. And he would sit at home recording them onto cassettes, so that when he was in the car, he could play these very mournful, romantic songs. And so it was a lot of Bengali influence, as well as trying to be desperately British.
I sometimes have so much envy of my parents because of how simple belonging was in a way for them. But for myself and for people like yourselves, I just, you know, there are so many different nostalgias that I'm battling at the same time that it's that it can be positively overwhelming. But you know, one thing that is common between the two of you, and perhaps me as well on this stage, is the Bengali language. You're both native Bengali speakers, but behind that one common identity, there may be so many other divergent experiences. I'm curious about how your own sense of what it means to be a Bengali, your Bengali consciousness, if you will, has evolved over the years, because obviously there's a certain given there as well. You are the kind of Bengali that your parents are, or that your family is, but then through your interactions with the Bengali-speaking diaspora in London, in the UK, how has that sense evolved for the both of you? You want to start? You can start.
Now, just to before I come to this, just to add to your experience, you know, similarly in Guwahati, which is in India, my father having moved, always used to Guwahati, always used to say, "Home is Calcutta, we'll go back," and you know, very similarly to what your parents would say. And I would desperately want to be an Assamese and believe in the Assamese politics and the language just trying to belong, to be an Assamese. I wanted to mask myself. Talking about being a Bengali and today and then before, very much like yours, my parents would play the same songs perhaps, and I desperately shunned them as a child. Similar kind of probably pop music and country music. A lot of country music used to come to Assam. But I think my sense of being a Bengali and a Bengali migrant suddenly comes to the fore once my son is born. And he's named in a particular way, and we can talk about it sometime. But the moment my son is born, I'm desperate to tell him who I am. And just my father has just passed, a month later my son is born. And there's this moment of absolute joy and sadness at the same time. So I start inventing homelands for me, which I never had. Shantiniketan. I went and lived for a year in Shantiniketan. I've never been to Shantiniketan before this. Suddenly, my son is singing Purano Shei Diner Kotha and going to Tagore's primary school. Poor kid was traumatized beyond hell, and he was not allowed to speak any English there. So after about 2 weeks of struggling, he kind of collapsed and just said, I can't do this anymore. But he lived in Shantiniketan. And this is a false nostalgia which I created for myself, believing that this is who I was. At a certain point, it breaks. But I think my Bengali identity only comes, as I said, when I think that there's something to be passed on. Before that, I was quite at ease with being even in England, marrying a white British girl. I mean, I pretty much avoided India, Bengal, Durga Puja, anything to do with back home nostalgia till that point. Delhi was only nostalgia.
But perhaps it's also given you an opportunity to engage with the wider Bengali-speaking diaspora, right? Because obviously after the partition of Bengal and the creation of, Bangladesh,
yes.
Our borders are quite bloody.
Yes.
But so, when you come to the UK,
it changes very much, and this is in recent years, as you well know, when Bangladesh, the 50 years of Bangladesh was not very long back, and my wife is British, white British, but we brought out an album together, music album. Georgie's musical, I'm not. I produced it for musicians from West Bengal and Bangladesh, singing songs written in those times as 1971 was happening, but written both in West Bengal and Bangladesh, and Dhaka then. So these are things I would never have imagined myself as a Bengali growing up in Guwahati, being force-fed Rabindra Sangeet. So these are evolving stuff. I think we all realize things about each other, but I think the moment is that when you think, what do I tell the next generation who is so bereft of, India? And my son used to say that he's half Indian, half English, two people. Now his thing has changed. And it's interesting. He says, I'm full English, full Indian, right? It's like the full English breakfast, God forbid. But he decides that he can take on both identities simultaneously and well, right? So if he goes home, it's mishti doi and white rice, and ma feeding him. Here, he wouldn't want to have anything to do with his Indian identity in his school here, but he tries and completely turns it around. For the last 275 days now, he's been doing Duolingo Hindi on his own every night. So he can actually now start to speak Hindi. But these are things I have not spoken about. I wanted to do Bengali, but there's no Duolingo in Bangla. So we'll wait.
Well, there's Shantiniketan for that.
Yes.
But when you were talking earlier, you brought up the fact that you were identified by your name. Your name determined your status in the UK, but your surname, your caste name, determined your status in India, in West Bengal. And casteism and racism have often been equated, but they also play out in very different ways. I wonder, when you were thinking through this sort of friction between these two identities, what are the points of convergence and divergence you found in the way that these prejudices operate?
Well, it's really interesting, actually. My mum, who both my parents faced a lot of racism when they came over here. My mum was, abused on the streets when she wore a sari and quickly switched to wearing trousers. My aunt was spat at from the bus. My mum was assaulted. But it was weird. She almost had not sympathy, but could understand the feelings that the racists had towards her, because I remember her relating it back to the way that they thought about lower castes, but also the way that they thought about not just the Dalits, but also the Muslims in their area. And the discrimination that they, as a class, as a caste, enacted on other people that they were around. And she almost was like, I think, quite bewildered at first, rather than being, thinking this is really wrong. It was like, how are they doing this to me? I'm an upper caste woman, and she was used to being incredibly privileged, and she admits that. But one of the things about caste that I find, that is a point of difference, not a point of difference, that is different in a way, is that it's something that is divinely ordained. Yeah. There is no escape from it. And sometimes I feel like caste has gone under the radar. So there were the whole kind of, rightly, the sort of whole protest around Black Lives Matter, and there has been quite a lot of discussion about colonialism, but I feel like over here, caste is not really mentioned. I think people are maybe scared of mentioning it because it's also tied up with people being afraid of criticising Indians and India because of the colonial past as well. But what I remember my parents telling me, they lived in a place called Chonnanogal, and the place that they grew up in was called Narua, which was essentially just one little narrow lane. It was almost like a place sort of that had not ever moved in time. It had been the same for about 300 years, with the Baromundi, the 12 temples at the end. And it was just the high caste families that lived there. So the Banerjees, the Chatterjees, the Patoks, the Pundits, where you get the English word pundit comes from the surname Pundit. And geographically and psychologically, they were completely separated from the Dalits, then known really abhorrently as the untouchables. And they were in a completely other bit of town, which was really, really poor. And they were consigned to jobs like, cleaning out toilets, cleaning out the sewage system, and absolutely, I think for me, it feels like traumatized generationally by the caste system. And there's no movement. That's what's so really frightening about it, that people feel and are forced to be in these situations, socially stratified by God's law. But in terms of race over here, yes, it was horrific when we were growing up over here. And I think that's partly why I wanted to write the book, is to talk about us as a generation. But one of the things that's most pernicious, I think, here is not just race, but it's class. So I kind of switched classes when I became an adult. So I grew up in a very working class environment, went to a working class comprehensive school. But then I entered the British media, which is something else, where the classism and the racism that is going on is incredibly subtle. You will never even know that you're being discriminated against. You would just feel utterly shit about yourself and think that it's all your own fault that you're not getting on. And I worked at the BBC and at Channel 4, and yes, I kind of did okay, but it was really difficult. And I would watch friends of mine with less experience, equally qualified, less experience, whatever, just being propelled, nurtured. The execs were always, seemed to be of a homogenous, white, middle class, Oxbridge, privately educated group. Until when I came to write the book, I realised that I wasn't imagining it. When I looked at the statistics for my field, which was directing at the BBC, directors of factual television in 2016, which was the latest statistics that there are, only, I think, 3% were black or Asian. So this kind of discrimination that I felt was real, but it was a mixture of race and class. And I think there are strong parallels with the caste system in terms of, you know, economic, social, cultural capital that is passed down through the generations.
Yeah. Shom, when we talk about the partition of India, the dominant story is the partition of Punjab, but the partition of Bengal and thereafter the creation of Bangladesh are the backdrop to your novel. In that sense, it's also a historical novel. A couple of months ago, I was recommending this novel in my podcast that I co-host when the coup happened in Bangladesh, because I was telling people that, you know, if you want to understand the fault lines and how far back they go, this is a very good way for people to kind of really get a sense of what's going on. And there are some real life historical characters who also are fictionalized in your book, etc. I wonder, you know, having written this book now, and like you said, when you're writing the book, you're probably not thinking of these things consciously, but having written this book, how do you view these fault lines and the role that they are playing in the Indian subcontinent, in South Asia right now, particularly in the situation that is playing out in Bangladesh?
You know, I mean, just to go back a bit, when I was writing this book and I was, you know, sent out a few versions to friends to read, friends here too, I was gobsmacked by how people didn't know Bangladesh, what happened. They had no idea that 3 countries happened out of India. They were so messed up. Somebody wrote back saying, "Oh, I was there for the concert for Bangladesh, but I didn't know what Bangladesh was." I'm like, well, you shouldn't say this out loud. So there's this absolute kind of lack of historical knowledge here, that partition, India, Pakistan, then things kept happening and things keep happening now. It's not over, the story, you know. So there's a kind of blockage there. That is one. The second is, you say that, yes, when we talk of partition, we mainly talk of Punjab and the north, and the east is kind of forgotten. I don't know why that is. Maybe because of the cultural powerhouse that the north of India has become, and being able to talk about it, and great films and literature being made, while perhaps filmmakers like Ritwik Ghatak and writers who came in from Bangladesh, they're less spoken about in the national consciousness. Perhaps that could be one reason. Now, when we talk about fault lines of today, and this is where I think understanding history is so important. This is why perhaps the book, as you say, is important, because you have to understand the context in which this is happening. It's not that, inept, corrupt rulers of Asia and Africa not understanding how to be democracies. The roots go far back, and sadly it always seems to come back to a tiny island. That's the truth. You know, the fault lines of the world, I mean, Palestine could be one good place to start. It just comes back here. How much damage has happened from this one tiny island? Yeah. So therefore history is important. Therefore understanding the present in the context of the past is important. The last Prime Minister of Bangladesh did not happen in isolation, sadly. So yeah, that's all. And therefore read books like this, read Red River, and you'll get a context of why we are here and why we keep on saying, you know, this was not meant to be, this was not supposed to be like this. There are things which have happened, which have shaped our present history in this manner, you know.
I'm going to ask both of you one final question before I open it up to the audience. Sheela, you mentioned when you were introducing your book that you write about yourself and your friends in the book. I wonder what it was like for you to include your friends in this narrative, because again, we take it for granted that we have a certain kind of knowingness, a certain kind of intimacy with our close friends. But writing a book like this, to my mind, will reveal things to you about your own friends that you perhaps were blind to before. So I wonder what that experience was like.
Deep.
Oh my goodness, it was hard. It was really hard. You know, it's some of my best friends in the book. I just wanted to say also with your book, one of the most powerful things that you've done is tell the story of these wider things, but through this incredible story of the friendship between the three boys.
That is another thing that's
so
common
lovely.
to friendship. Is another thing. That is why I wanted to end the conversation on that.
So lovely.
Yeah.
It really kind of brings it home to you, the complexities.
Yeah.
It's not just about division, you
Yeah.
know. Writing about my friends was not an easy. It's not an easy thing to do. There's something about, you know, journalism, making films, writing a book, where you slightly feel like you're taking something from people when they're telling you their story, and it's an incredible amount of trust that they have to have. And at stake is not just will they like it or not. It was also about will my friendship survive. You know, because I'm writing about quite difficult things in the book as well, because a couple of my friends had a really tricky time with their families, and one of them I partly tell that story as well. You know, her father and mother were absolutely insistent that she had to leave college and have an arranged marriage. She's Greek Cypriot, and her father's died, and it was difficult writing that story. So it's quite hard, but what I love about writing about my friends is that it's our story as a generation, and we're all in our 50s, we're all the, you know, second, third generation of immigrants, and like you say, all of us, we're, you know, mixture of Indian, Sri Lankan, Greek Cypriot, Jamaican. Where does this all go back to? You know, the racism that we experienced, or the problems at work, or the fractures in their family. A lot of it goes back to colonialism and the kind of shocks and the divisions created by that system. And so I wanted to tell our story, and it was a powerful thing. I think it was a powerful thing for all of us, having our stories written down.
I wish I could do that for my friends. I think it's extraordinary what you've done. But that's, like I was saying, the other thing that's common to both these books is friendship. You tell this story through the story of these three friends and their relationship, and they represent also three different points of view in the book. Yeah. Where did that story come to you from?
I think childhood, you know, in the sense that when I always thought of my childhood as a happy childhood. You know, that's the kind of illusion I have carried, thinking that, oh, I had a good time. And at the same time, when I kind of look at it or read about the time in Assam, you know, you'd have signs like, look on a bus, look under your seat, there might be a bomb. Now you were seeing, I mean, I must have seen this as a 7-year-old, 8-year-old. So how was I kind of dealing with it? That was one of those explorations. And then when you start thinking about that time, you also think of your friends. And I had my best friend in this book, a character called Rizu, was a tall Assamese fellow. He's a gangster now, you know, total gangster, yeah? He's a property dealer carrying a gun. I went and met him, and he was my best friend, but at any given moment, he would call me a bongal and start, you know, kind of having fights with me if anything goes wrong. But we were dear friends. We would go and fight for Amitabh Bachchan first day, first show movie to try and get in. We would have our adventures together. But Assamese and Bengali, his parents never came to my house. My parents never went. There was no conversation. How did an Assamese boy and a Bengali boy become best friends? When I look back at it now, I just don't understand it. So I wanted to explore. I mean, for me, it was almost like I don't want to pay money to a therapist. I want to do this myself. So it took 13 years. I'm not joking. So that happened, and then there was this historical moment that the army had come in, right, to Assam. As we were kids, there were soldiers with guns on the streets. We saw them every day. School, back home. That violence had become normalized. We didn't react to it anymore. So we were never friends with an army man's So that came much later in life when I moved to Delhi. So that is fictional. So I brought my Delhi army boy friend, who was my hostel roommate, into this story. A brilliant, beautiful young man, right? And I wanted to see what would happen if an army man comes into. And then from there, the three ideas of separatism, refugee, and army all come in. And it develops, and I love those three boys so much now. You know, it's very difficult to be devoid of them. I always keep thinking that they are real and that they are part of me. And I go back to Guwahati, and so my friends from this school now come back and chat with me and talk to me. My headmaster has stopped talking to me. And if you do read the book, at the end, he does come out to be a good fellow. But in the beginning, I refer to him as boys would refer to their slightly crooked headmaster, right, with a cane in hand. And the man he threw a big party for the book launch, 900 people, on his 70th birthday. And then he made the mistake of reading the book. And now he doesn't talk to me anymore. I have written back, I said, get till the end. Really, get till the end, Father. You'll be redeemed. No answer.
No answer. I think that's what I love so much about this book, because at one level it's this sort of epic literary novel with themes that are so resonant in the world that we live in. At another level, it's just Sholay, and it's so well done.
You said Akbar Anthony the last time.
Anthony, yes, of course. But okay, with that, I'll just open it up to the audience. I think we have about 10 minutes to go. Is there a mic going around? Do we have any questions?
Is that a question?
Is there okay.
You alluded to caste as a divine something. So it's always going to be there, is my impression, is what you're trying to say. The question really is, caste in Britain today, is it alive and well?
I can only speak from personal experience, because I'm not an expert on, say, the Gujarati community or the Punjabi community, where, you know, I don't know what the status of caste is. I know that in my own family, no, not at all. It's not an issue, and it was. My father actually really disliked caste, and his younger sister, my youngest aunt, actually married out of caste and married somebody in the caste below, and it was a huge scandal, and my father encouraged her to run away with her husband, come over here, and they came over here and they got married in secret, and she didn't actually speak to her parents for several years, and so in my family over here, it doesn't really play a part as such. But what I do know has happened is that the cultural, social, economic capital of caste has been passed down to me, definitely, because how is it that I went to this really working class school where barely anyone went to university, yet, you know, here I am, I've got a PhD, I've taught in academia, I worked at the BBC, obviously something got passed down. You know, so in that way, it survives, and I think in a unfortunately in a sense of superiority amongst some members of my community, especially the higher caste ones, and that's what I really don't like. I think from having been backwards and forwards and really seeing it, is it with an outsider's eyes. I just So to answer your question, I don't really know about other communities, but in my family, no.
All these different communities that we're talking about, do they marry do people, generally speaking, marry within that individual community? So will a Gujarati marry a Punjabi? Or I know that people marry British people, English people, so that's accepted. But I see less of people from different communities marrying across, suggesting to me that the caste system is still so embedded within all these different communities.
Hello, Sheela and so. Sheela, you grew up here, and this is all about discussion about teaching kids now about colonialism, about stories that, of the part of what the British, this little island did. Very, very important for the kids growing up here to really understand what's going on. And given the fact London is so full of people from all over the world right now, and especially Shom, as you were saying, you were almost creating a story for Roby in terms of creating where he is coming from effectively.
Yeah.
What should be the shape of that system? Of that, because I know there used to be something called Chemkoli, there used to be a mythical village as part of the education system somewhere. I don't know if you grew up with that. But my wife and I, we run a little dance thing, and it's something that was taught as part of the curriculum in the UK, which is an interesting one, which was telling the story of this little village in India, Chemkoli. What should be the kind of stories that should be told in part of the education system here, so that people get a sense of what is the history of this little island, what its impact has been around the world?
Do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, just to give you a concrete example, I mean, I'm speaking of Georgie is not here, but Georgie's idea of India and Indians in school were the corner shop boy. And she told me this herself. Until she went to university and did an English literature at Leeds, which is quite radical, with a lady called Ananya Jahanara Kabir, she had no idea of what impact England had on the rest of the world. I mean, so a starting point would be teaching English history properly to school kids. Yeah, that's it. Just teach them, like we learn about Indian history, teach them English history, however violent it is. They do that in Germany very well, right? You don't have to be that, forceful perhaps, but you can just say, this is our country's history, this is why we are so rich. That's it.
Anything that you'd like to add, Sheela? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up learning history. I did history till I was 16. I think we spent a week on the empire, probably a day maybe on India.
Spoke about railways.
Probably spoke about railways. And as you say, this is why this country is the 6th richest country in the world. And, so yes, it absolutely should be a fundamental part of the education system here. And as far as I can tell, at that GCSE level, my daughter did history till she was 14, I think. I think she barely learned anything.
There's just none. Even today, there's none.
Barely learned anything. And so when you get all this kind of conversation about the boats and the race riots and the general talk of immigrants who are coming over here to take something that's not theirs, the background to this, a lot of it, is that they have got no knowledge of the role that Britain played in the world and where Britain got its wealth from. So, yeah.
There's a question here.
Hi. A very lovely discussion. Thank you very much. I think most of us, being first generation, second generation, or third generation, can identify to some or a lot of it. So really enjoyed it. My question is to you, Sheela, specifically. You mentioned about BBC. Now, I don't know how long ago that was, but particularly since the Black Lives Matter, you see a lot of colored faces on screen on BBC. In your opinion, is that across the board, is that reflected behind the scenes as well, or is it just a face of the organization that is trying to make a statement, but whether it has flown down and institutionally, think you see that things are changing?
Well, I think around the time of Black Lives Matter, things suddenly did seem to change. There were lots more faces on TV. But again, when I saw the faces, when you see dramas with lots of, Black and Asian faces, often they will be playing an essentially white character. So it won't be our stories that are being told, or very few. There'll be the odd series once a year or something. But it will be within, say, you know, I remember watching a detective series on ITV, and there was an Indian character, and she was called something like Zoe. And I thought, I don't know any Indian Zoes. What is this? And also, I feel that when I've checked, I've looked just out of interest at the Meet the Team pages in some of our biggest production companies, TV production companies, because I've wanted to see, you know, what's the situation now, because it was quite a while ago that I was in TV. And it's the same. It's exactly the same. All the head people, you know, the head of, you know, production, the head of the creative department, all the senior figures will be the Toms, the Joshes, the Claires, the Graces, you know, these will be the names still. And I know that what's been happening lately from friends of mine that are still in TV is that they are absolutely, it seems like it's lip service now when it comes to diversity, and they're all fed up with it. It's kind of out of fashion. And if you look at the BBC, I think they've gone through about 4 or 5 different diversity officers, heads of diversity in the last couple of years, and people can't work there. And, you know, this will be because, yes, you have a head of diversity, but it needs buy-in from the rest of the management. You need to nurture people, not just get a few people in to show that you're ticking boxes. They need to be included and nurtured like my white friends were, who were looked after by the executives who saw in these younger people reflections of themselves. So I don't think it's hugely changed. It's changed a bit.
Do we have time for another question or two? One question? All right. Well, you pick who you want to give the mic to.
Thank you. My question is to Somnath and the rest. I mean, as an immigrant moving from one area to another, a continent to another continent, and such, what do you call home? Where do you get solace as being at home?
That's the most difficult question of all to answer. Home to me, home is today not a geographical place. It's a sense of things, you know, friendships, cups of tea, snatches of songs, readings. So I have to create home. I mean, you know, if I stay too long in a place, I feel at home now. It's just incredible need to create and believe in places where one can belong, and it's very difficult. It's fictional. It's a profound question. I mean, and I can go on and on, but I think it's an idea. Home is an idea now, and because we are migrants, we'll have to live with this reality that there's no going back, because I don't know where to go back. I can't go back to Assam or Guwahati. Guwahati is a different place today. I can't go back to Dhaka of my fathers. So the idea of going back doesn't exist geographically. We find momentary solace in situations. Like, so when I meet Pragya, there's an immense feeling of being at home. Or when I suddenly meet Sheela, my cousin Sheela of Shermit, and it's just, we talk. And there's this language. With Pragya, we might talk about Dosti and have a Hindi film song reference, or Amar Akbar Anthony. So these are fragments now. I don't think there's a geographical place. And sometimes you don't want to go back to that geographical place for many reasons, one of them being political, right? So all of those things play at the same time, I think. But it's a deep question. I don't think I have time to answer it fully. But yeah, it's an exploration. It's an exploration.
But I just want to add one very quick thing. That it's interesting that for someone like myself, I don't feel at home. So when I go to Calcutta or when I go to Ayodhya is of course again, you know, on a very rife political fault line. When I go to these places, I don't actually, and my mum's side is from Punjab, which is in Pakistan now. I actually don't like being in these places, but there is a recognition that this geography, this culture has shaped me. But my feeling of home, which is my feeling of safety and belonging and acceptance now, is really just with my close friends and in conversations and in cultural snippets. Sorry, Sheela.
Yeah, that's so interesting what you say about friends, because I don't really have a home because, you know, I grew up in Hayes mainly, and Hayes didn't really like me, so it can't be my home. But I've chosen a place to live. You know, I live in Hackney in London, partly because my friends live close by, and I don't have that dream of escaping London because I wouldn't be near my friends and my family, and that's really what home is. And also one of the poignant things, you know, I've had, you know, relatives die and a close friend died, and they scatter their ashes. And then it makes me think about, not morbidly, but where would they scatter my ashes? Where's my place that is my home? And I can't really think of one in that way, one that really is my home.
I have thought about this, but we can talk about it offline. Thank you for listening to us. Sorry, they've told us that we're out of time. But thank you all for being such a terrific audience. Thank you.